Australia's most wanted man. Although Australia was first sighted by the Dutch in 1606, the interior was still largely unexplored 2.5 centuries later, when a German adventurer set out to cross the continent from east to west. He was walking into a great unknown. Even in his native Germany, the name Ludwig Leichhardt is known today only to students of the history of exploration. But in Australia, he has been granted lasting fame both for his controversial exploits on that continent and for his mysterious disappearance there. A river, a waterfall, a mountain range, a mountain peak, and a district in Sydney all bear his name. His statue was erected in that city, and just a few years ago the Ludwig Leichhardt Foundation was established. Australia's Nobel Prize-winning novelist Patrick White incorporated the explorer's story into his novel Voss, later the basis for an opera. 9 major expeditions and countless smaller searches have combed the continent since Leichhardt and his party of 6 disappeared on his last expedition in 1848. Their fate is the great mystery in the history of the discovery of my country, says Australian writer Gordon Connell. Leichhardt's celebrity is all the more curious when one probes his background and tries to judge his accomplishments. A student's wanderlust. Born in Prussia on October 23, 1813, Ludwig Leichhardt was the son of a farmer, with little prospect of an exciting future. But his scholarly nature won him admission to the University of Tingen, where he was supposed to train as a high school teacher. 2 fellow students, English brothers named John and William Nicholson, must have perceived Leichhardt's potential and persuaded him to switch to the study of science and medicine at the University of Berlin, even offering to support him during his studies. After only 2 years in Berlin, still not prepared for a profession and wanting to avoid compulsory military service, Leichhardt joined William Nicholson in London in May 1837. Later the two roamed about France, Switzerland, and Italy and hatched a plan to go to Australia, a largely unknown continent open to British settlement only a half-century earlier. When the time for departure came, Nicholson changed his mind about going, but he paid his friend's passage and gave him some money with which to start a new life. Thus endowed, Ludwig Leichhardt, or as he now liked to call himself, Dr. Leichhardt, set out on his own for the long voyage to the southern hemisphere in October 1841. Caption from original layout. Leichhardt's 3 expeditions are traced on the map of Australia above. The making of an explorer. The 28-year-old German who arrived in Sydney on February 14, 1842, was described by a contemporary as being more than 6 feet tall, with a high intellectual forehead, small gray, intelligent eyes, and dark brown hair. The lower part of his face was hidden by a bushy beard and mustache, the nose slightly curved. During the next 2 years, Leichhardt supported himself by lecturing on botany and geology and made minor field trips to collect plants, insects, and rock samples. About this time he conceived the notion of achieving fame by exploring the interior, or what he called that kernel of the dark continent. Although he made an epic overland walk of 600 miles from Newcastle to Brisbane, Leichhardt was scarcely qualified to become an explorer. He was nearsighted, terrified of firearms, and had little sense of direction. His services, not surprisingly, were spurned by the Surveyor General of New South Wales. At Brisbane, Leichhardt heard that a government expedition across northeastern Australia to a military outpost at Port Essington had been called off for lack of funds. Yet the coastal farmers remained eager to learn of suitable agricultural land in the interior. Seizing the opportunity, Leichhardt returned to Sydney, announced his plan to lead a private expedition as a replacement for the cancelled government undertaking, and soon had 5 recruits as well as the necessary financial backing. Setting a leisurely pace, back in Brisbane, Leichhardt added 4 more men to his expedition, and thus it was a party of 10 too soon turned back that set out from the last outpost of civilization on October 1, 1844, cheerfully singing God Save the Queen. Their goal, Port Essington, was 2,000 miles to the northwest as the crow flies. But Leichhardt planned to follow rivers just inland from the coastline and avoid the interior, which his only map showed as blank. To transport the expedition's 1,200 pounds of provisions, Leichhardt exchanged some of his horses for slow-moving bullocks, which could also be slaughtered for meat en route. Incredibly, the expedition carried only 1 2-gallon water container in addition to individual canteens, and this dictated Leichhardt's water strategy. At the first water hole, camp was set up while a search party was sent to find the next one and return to lead the others to it. Although it guaranteed a safe advance, it did not promise speed. By February 1845, Leichhardt calculated that 1/4 of the journey had been completed, although 3/4 of the food supplies were gone. Once, the leader himself, accompanied only by one of the expedition's 2 Aboriginal men, was lost for several days, surviving on 2 pigeons the native shot. "I swallowed the bones and the feet of the pigeon to allay the cravings of my stomach," Leichhardt wrote. Soon gonas, possums, emus, kangaroos, and birds of all kinds were happily consigned to the stewing pot. "It is remarkable how soon man becomes indifferent to the niceties of food," the expedition leader observed. "From the rivers they caught crayfish and eels to vary their diet. Nests of native bees provided the sweetest and most aromatic honey we had ever tasted. Wild herbs gave extra strength to tea and soups, and by cautious experiment, Leichhardt found that certain plants growing near water holes could be cooked and eaten to ward off scurvy, though severe diarrhea was an unfortunate side effect." Through March and April, the explorers continued their stately progress, attaching the names of friends back on the coast to rivers and mountains they passed. Early in May, the party left the last river flowing eastward and struck out northwestward for the Gulf of Carpentaria and their destination on the north coast. By the end of June, the party was approaching the Gulf of Carpentaria when spear-throwing natives made a nocturnal attack on the tents. John Gilbert, the expedition's naturalist, was killed, and 2 other men were wounded. After only 2 days' rest, they continued the journey, badly shaken but determined to reach their goal. On December 17, 1845, after a 14-month trek of nearly 3,000 miles, the Leichhardt expedition marched into Port Essington, Australia's hero. The explorers returned to Sydney by sea and were given a hero's welcome, greeted as if back from the grave. "I thought the whole town would go mad with joy," Leichhardt wrote. He had mapped a considerable portion of northeastern Australia and revealed it to be an excellent country available, almost in its whole extent, for pastoral purposes. A grateful citizenry rewarded Leichhardt the first money the 32-year-old explorer had ever earned and raised an additional sum to be shared among the 6 others. With such a claim now his, Leichhardt had little difficulty raising funds for a second expedition, this one to traverse the northern half of the continent and then travel south along the western coast to Perth. Accompanied by 6 white men and 2 Aboriginal men, and with a caravan that included 270 goats, 108 sheep, and 40 oxen, as well as mules and sheepdogs, Leichhardt embarked on his second expedition on December 7, 1846. Experiencing the full rigor of the rainy season, the men were soaked through night and day as their lightweight tents were torn to shreds. Soon the entire party was stricken with fever and ague, sometimes with only cold, muddy water to drink, since no one was strong enough to light a fire and make tea. When they did have food to eat, they ended up swallowing about 20 FLIs with each mouthful. In temperatures of up to 107 degrees, the men had to ride fully covered to avoid the stinging bites of sandflies. Their horses often streamed with blood from the insect attacks. Within 6 months, the party returned, having traveled only 500 miles through what one member of the expedition called the most horrible country the foot of a white man ever trod. Illness and dissension. Leichhardt was accused of taking food from the sick had doomed the expedition from the start. The last march. Leichhardt was not the man to give up his dream of crossing the continent, and despite the miserable failure of his second expedition, had another party ready early in 1848. On April 4, he wrote his last letter, from a sheep station some 250 miles inland from Brisbane, before setting out in a northwesterly direction with 4 white comrades and 2 Aboriginal men, 50 bullocks, 20 mules, and 7 horses. 2.5 years passed with no news of the Leichhardt expedition, not yet cause for concern to his friends and sponsors, who understood the enormity of the undertaking. But toward the end of 1850, an Aboriginal man appeared at Surat, a sheep station less than 50 miles south of Leichhardt's jumping-off point, with an alarming story. From another native in the interior, he had heard of a massacre of several white men and 2 blacks just west of the Maranoa River, which would have been directly in Leichhardt's line of march. Attacking at night, the natives had killed the entire party, slaughtered the animals, and made off with pots and blankets. Trees marked with an L. A ship was sent to Port Essington, in the event that Leichhardt might emerge in that vicinity after retracing his earlier successful expedition, but he had not been seen there. Surveying in the northwest, John McDouall Stewart reported finding mysterious footprints in an area not known to have been previously penetrated by white men. The footprints, Stewart said, were long and narrow, with a high arch at the sole's inner side and strongly pronounced big toe, more like the footprint of a white man than the one of an Aboriginal. Finally, after a settler named Gideon Lang confirmed reports of a massacre beyond the Maranoa River, the government voted funds for a search which, because of drought, was not undertaken until 1852. When the designated leader of the search party was washed overboard and drowned en route from Sydney to Brisbane, leadership fell to Hovenden Healy, a member of Leichhardt's second expedition. Now convinced that the explorers had been killed west of the Maranoa River, Healy concentrated his search in that area. Other natives repeated the massacre story, saying that the attack had been provoked when the two Aboriginal men among Leichhardt's party had molested some local native women. Moving on to the Wargo River in mid-June 1852, Healy found traces of an old campsite and a tree into the trunk of which had been carved the letter L, and over it Xva. Could the L stand for Leichhardt and the Xva be read as 15 April? A date only 11 days after the expedition was last seen. Nearby were two other trees similarly marked. Healy abandoned his search and returned with a report that the missing men undoubtedly had been killed by Aboriginal people. The Wild White Man. Two more searches were dispatched before the end of the decade, and in April 1861 came the report from the same Stewart who had found the footprints a decade earlier of an abandoned hut near Mount Sturt in the northwestern corner of New South Wales. It seemed to have been built by a white man rather than an Aboriginal. Other L trees were found. Then, in 1871, after repeated rumors of a wild white man living among Aboriginal people in western Queensland, a police officer named J.M. Gilmore led a new search. He returned from the interior with 6 pairs of men's trousers, parts of a tent, remains of woolen blankets, a bag made of human hair straight and thus from a white man, and bones that also proved to be of white men. Relics of a missing expedition, undoubtedly. But which one? Leichhardt was not the only explorer to have vanished in those years. In 1938, 90 years after Leichhardt's disappearance, yet another search, the 9th, was organized, prompted by reports of bones found at the edge of the Simpson Desert. The bones proved to be those of Aboriginal people, but 2 British coins minted before Leichhardt left England were also recovered. Could they have been his? Death at the Diamantina River. After painstaking research and evaluation of all previously accumulated findings, Gordon Connell published his conclusion about the fate of Ludwig Leichhardt in 1980. It has been largely accepted by experts. Unable to follow his intended route across the northern half of the continent, Leichhardt reached Arnhem Land but then turned south, perhaps to retrace his steps back to Queensland. At a waterhole near where the Diamantina River crosses the border into South Australia, he and his men were ambushed and killed. Bones of white men have been found there. If Connell is correct, Leichhardt would have covered some 3,000 miles more than any other explorer up to that time. Yet, apparently, tragedy overtook him only 500 miles from his departure point. Any knowledge of the continent's interior comes not from Leichhardt but from the many search parties sent to find him. Australia's native peoples. The native population of Australia, the Aboriginal peoples, arrived on the southern continent some 40,000 years ago via stepping stone islands from Southeast Asia. In January 1788, the first British colonists, 736 male and female convict exiles, arrived at Sydney Harbour aboard the 11 vessels of the First Fleet. They were much less fit for survival in their new homeland than were the Stone Age people they encountered. These hunter-gatherers roamed about nearly naked, with boomerangs, spears, stone axes, and fire sticks as their main hunting weapons. There were perhaps 300,000 natives, divided among 600 tribes with differing languages and customs. All were deeply rooted in nature. Men were patient and skilled hunters. Women were discriminating plant gatherers. Each tribe had an area that supported its members. These territorial rights were strictly respected. The fate of the Aboriginal peoples, like that of North America's Indians, is a painful episode in the history of European discovery and settlement of new worlds. The British assumed sovereignty over land needed for the penal colonies, with little or no regard for the territorial claims of the tribes. The official goal was to establish a peaceful relationship with Aboriginal people. In reality, few of the convict settlers shared such humanitarian goals. Wheresoever the European put his foot down, Charles Darwin wrote after a visit to Australia in 1836, the death of the natives seems to follow. Deprived of their hunting grounds, infected with new diseases, corrupted by alcohol, conscripted for cheap labor, their children forced into missionary schools, hunted down and killed in the interest of pacification, Aboriginal people suffered a devastating decline. By 1901, the population had dropped to 66,950, and by 1921 to 60,479. World War II marked a turning point in Australia's treatment of the native peoples. With thousands of soldiers sent overseas, the country's workforce was depleted. Aboriginal people found new employment opportunities, in many cases receiving cash wages for the first time. In the post-war years, they obtained citizenship and the right to vote, better education and health care, the right to hold land, and a choice between remaining Aboriginal or assimilating with European Australians. A population surge brought their strength to 144,465 in 1981.